Thank you, Linda Way. We always like to have our Black Facts. Dr. Hendricks, we do at the Washington Informer, we do Black History 365 days a year. So, so glad to always have that segment of the program. And we'll be talking about you one day in Black Facts because of what you're doing in the area of environmental, helping to save the environment. So welcome to WIN TV.
Much, Denise. Thank you for having me. Thank you for finding me and inviting me to be in conversation with you this afternoon.
So you're professor at the University of Maryland?
I am.
What are you teaching there?
Yeah, I'm currently an assistant professor of urban studies and planning. I also direct the Stormwater Infrastructure Resilience and Justice Lab in the School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. I also happen to be a faculty affiliate with the Maryland Institute for Applied Environmental Health and the School of Public Health at the university, amongst a number of other affiliations across the campus.
Dr. Hendricks, how did you get into this whole area of the environment or sustainability?
Sure. I think, for many of us who grew up in environments that were plagued by environmental issues, we have sort of a conviction or a calling in this space. And that was essentially sort of my story in terms of how I got involved in my trajectory and current research program. I grew up in a low-income Black and Latinx community in inner city Dallas. And we were plagued by a number of environmental issues, including stormwater issues, by which, we experienced circumstances where, our local stormwater infrastructure was distressed, always filled with litter, trash, and debris. And there were a number of circumstances when, storm events overwhelmed those systems and caused flooding in our community, and particularly in my home that I grew up in. And so that lived experience, sort of begged a question of what was it about my community that created these circumstances that were very different and starkly different than other communities when I would travel across town, and really inspired me to sort of get after the root causes of some of these issues at the intersection of, what I like to call the human-built environment, because the built environment doesn't, manifest out of the abyss. I mean, there are human decisions that are made that construct the built environment, and what that looks like in light of, storm events and wet weather events that create these flood scenarios.
And so what did you discover?
What I discovered, thus far is that, there are, much like what we've seen over the past year in terms of access to, public health facilities, or even more recently in terms of the distribution of, the COVID vaccine, Black and brown communities and indigenous communities across the country lack access to a number of, social and environmental services that are supposed to benefit the community. And so when we talk about environmental justice, we think about, the social, the natural, and the built environment, and the ways in which, environmental laws, regulations, and policies haven't been applied fairly across all segments of the population. And so not only do we, have challenges in terms of access to vaccines, but we also lack access to grocery stores and healthy food outlets. We also lack access to green space, parks and recreation facilities, and including, stormwater infrastructure. And so what I've discovered thus far is that we have environmental issues on repeat in our communities that are presenting risk in terms of these natural hazards that will only become much more frequent and intense in a climate context and scenario.
So when you talk about stormwater issues, first of all, define stormwater. Does that mean like when it rains and then the rain washes debris into our sewer systems, which then end up into our waterways? Am I characterizing that properly?
Absolutely. Stormwater is, can be rainwater or snow melt that comes from precipitation events. And during these storm events, some water is absorbed by the ground or natural surfaces. That excess water puddles or flows across what we call impermeable surfaces or hard surfaces that doesn't allow the water to infiltrate. That excess water is called surface or stormwater runoff. When it comes to forests, wetlands, grassy areas, and other naturally landscaped surfaces that allow the water to permeate or infiltrate, that's one scenario. And in these natural situations, stormwater reaches our local water bodies gradually. But from a regulatory perspective, stormwater runoff must pass through some, built or engineered conveyance system, whether it's a gutter, a pipe, or concrete channel. And if it just simply runs over a natural surface or soaks into the soil through a natural process, it may be water generated by a storm, but technically, if it's not regulated and a part of that conveyance system that's built within our communities, is not considered stormwater runoff.
Okay, I got lost somewhere in there. Because from a practical standpoint, I know that in the District of Columbia, for example, there are particularly churches that had these large parking lots, and now they're being assisted in some ways, as opposed to being fined, to create like, I guess, water gardens or places that can absorb some of that water. But when the water when they're not permeable surfaces, as you mentioned, that water has to go somewhere. So is it the problem of, I just simply said, trash or debris going into the sewer systems? That's one issue. But it sounds like I'm hearing you say something in addition to that something happens with that water that impacts the environment. What am I missing in that?
Sure. I mean, I think, when we, over the last 150 years or so, as communities and cities have developed over time, and we've utilized concrete, we've essentially paved over natural surfaces or green spaces. And within this, phenomenon, essentially, we create issues of additional stormwater runoff that doesn't, percolate into the ground. And I think what you just mentioned, or, the situation that you described, is just that. And it's not only an issue of water quantity in terms of the slow or fast buildup of excessive, rainfall or, water, but it's also water quality issues in terms of contaminants that might be picked up as the water moves across these surfaces, in terms of what you mentioned, from litter, trash, or debris, or other point source pollutants in terms of industries or facilities that might be located in our communities. And again, going back to this environmental justice, issue, we know that Black and brown communities live in the closest proximity to what we call locally unwanted land uses, or, industrial sites that, again, can pose a risk in terms of contaminating this water as it moves across these built surfaces, again, creating, water quantity and water quality issues. And I think if you were sort of paying attention to, some of the recent flood events in the Washington, D.C., metropolitan area recently, not only did we hear about flooding, but we also heard about sanitary sewer overflows and basement backups, right?
Yes.
Where this rainfall is overwhelming the stormwater system and overwhelming the sewer system and causing backups into people's homes. And so these wet weather events, cause, sewage laden waters to back up into people's homes that pose a direct risk to environmental health and public health.
So, Dr. Hendricks, this information is definitely helpful. I mean, it helps to explain what's happening. I mean, we see it rain, or we see it snow, and we try to get rid of it. And we want them to put the salt down so that we don't have ice, not realizing we tell dogs not to walk your dogs without putting little boots on them because it'll affect their feet. But we don't think about what happens to that once it gets into our sewer system. But what are there recommendations that come out of the work that you do? Do you talk with community groups? What are you telling folks about how to actually not governments, but individuals, to what things we can do to eliminate this problem?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, honestly, there are things that we can do as individuals or at the household level, right? I think maintaining, our front and backyards and keeping them mowed, planting trees, planting other types of plants that create additional green space throughout the community, and making sure that we don't leave things out that could potentially contaminate water during storm events is helpful. Obviously, not pouring any, household liquids or cleaning materials down the drain is also helpful in terms of keeping water quality at a healthy level. But honestly, this is a challenge that's being faced, in communities across really the world. And specifically here in the U.S., where, again, we're experiencing more frequent and intense storm events. And again, I think in one of the previous segments, you talked about all of the development that's happening. And I think what we're seeing is that the development of stormwater infrastructure to manage this excessive water or stormwater runoff isn't keeping pace with the level of development that's happening above. And so, and we're just now realizing sort of, or acknowledging the benefits of preserving green spaces and investing in green infrastructure. We've been really, doing a lot of unsustainable development over the years. And so I think that there are, small scale changes at the household levels that we can do. Again, I think you mentioned opportunities for community gardens and sort of transforming vacant spaces throughout the community for uses like this. And again, maintaining your local your property in terms of your front and backyard. But it's really a neighborhood and municipal level issue. And we need to really be engaged with our locally elected leadership and city planners and engineers, and really thinking about how do we collaborate to develop master plans or community development plans that include some of these, green infrastructure and stormwater systems to help communities to manage this anticipated stormwater runoff to mitigate these issues.
Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Hendricks, for being with us and really for taking on this subject yourself, because we need people like you to talk about what's going on in communities like ours at the table. So, I mean, it sounds like there's a lot we need to learn. There's a lot we need to do to advocate for healthier communities, which means we have a healthier earth. And the stormwater issue is something that I think it's, like you said, we need to celebrate those gardens and those trees. So thank you so much for being with us today. Is there something you wanted to say before we closed out?
Yeah, I just wanted to say really quickly, I think a week ago today, President Biden announced his $2.2 trillion infrastructure bill. I think the time is right now for communities to start reaching out to their leadership to make sure that they're planned and accounted for and get their fair share of resources to really transform their communities in the ways that we talked about this afternoon.
Wonderful. I may follow up with you on that because there's probably maybe some community organizations that'll follow up with us and say, what was he talking about? Sure. So if there are ways that we can do that. So if that happens, I'll definitely reach out. We'll have you back, of course. I always like to invite our guests to come back and share more information with us. But I want to thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Denise.
All righty. Have a good one.
Okay, you too.